Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Erik Mobrand. Erik is an associate professor at Seoul National University, a scholar of democratic formation, social change, and legal regulation. He is also the author of a newly released book, Top-Down Democracy in South Korea, the link to which will be provided below, and this of course makes him incredibly well placed to talk about today's topic, which is the nature, the changes, and the legal structures that revolved around South Korea's shift to democracy, and how that democracy still currently exists today. There is a feeling out there that democracy wipes away all that came before it, that the authoritarianism, the oppression, the totalitarianism that existed before, in whatever manner it did, is cured by the shift to democracy. But of course this is not the case, and it's certainly not the case for South Korea, for which the shadow of the Cold War and its previous authoritarian government still hang over the country. This is a nation that was created out of deeply illiberal circumstances. And these circumstances did more than simply rule from the top. They built development from the bottom. They built the state up. And in many ways, they buried themselves deep inside the formal and informal structures of South Korean society, which of course is going to be a fundamental issue here. Just how those two things clash, this idea between a formal state and formal structure, and the informal ideas, expectations, and demands that run through society just as strongly. And it's from those previously mentioned early moments that you need to start any sort of analysis of where South Korea is today. That's within that authoritarian state-building experience. This is how labor was mobilized, class divides were forged, political institutions and parties came about, and the formal landscape of South Korean representation comes to be. The term for this, which is echoed throughout this podcast, is conservative democratization, and indeed a compressed modernity. And the hangovers from this period are still very much there for people to touch on. We're going to talk through the Political Parties Act of 1963, the Electoral Commission and its shift into becoming a constitutional body in 1960, and importantly the political parties' cancellation system. But of course the fundamental issue here is just how you undo authoritarianism. What aspects of the previous authoritarian regime should be kept and what should be wiped away? Just how much reforming should a society do? And of course this did happen inside South Korea. As it shifted towards democracy at the end of the late 1980s, a series of constitutional revisions were of course pushed through. But despite this, things such as the national security law still linger inside South Korea today. In many ways, democratization brought a new idea to those people who were until then excluded from power. Certain oppressive or broad-ranging laws such as this one, instead of tearing them down, they might be kept and used as a tool for themselves. In effect, why clean away something that could be useful? Which brings us forward to a very important question, and that revolves around the idea of just what a democracy is. Because as Erik will show throughout this podcast, it is much more than just a political system. It's something that requires vigilance, constant maintenance, and an enterprise that is never really complete, which of course is going to focus us in on some interesting periods in South Korean life, dating back all the way to the origins of its democracy, and with the fascinating phenomena of street leaders, those people who will go on to become powerful politicians, not just tying themselves closely to street crime, but actually being a part of it themselves. We are going to talk about the April Revolution of 1960, the Gwangju Uprising of 1980, and the June Struggle of 1987, but also much more recent events, such as the disbanding of the United Progressive Party by then President Park Geun-hye, under the guise of their existential threat to democracy itself. And of course we're going to talk about the downfall of Park, the Candlelight Revolution, and the important place that street protests like this hold in South Korea today. For all the limited pluralism, all the hangovers from authoritarian rule, and for all the legal restrictions and controls, this is a democracy whose informal structures are incredibly vibrant, incredibly strong, and incredibly resilient nonetheless. As of course is still being seen today with the protests for and against now removed Justice Minister Cho Guk. But from here on out, I'm going to let Erik walk us through these issues. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast directly at the Patreon link or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can always comment, share, or like the podcast across social media. All the help in this regard is greatly appreciated, as is any recommendations for future guests. On that, and to talk us through party law, political incorporation, and the lessons from South Korea's democratization, this is Erik Mobrand. Erik Mobrand, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot of your research focuses around South Korean democracy and the history of this and how it looks today and how these interact. So you have a very interesting take on this. So before we get too deep into all the fundamentals here, I might get you to plant a flag early on, because you have this wonderful way of looking at South Korean democracy. You write that there's a shadow of authoritarianism coming back from the Cold War that lingers over the country and its politics still today. And yet, contrary to what that may indicate to many people, you also see South Korea as an incredibly resilient democracy as well. So I might get to start just by opening up that space a little bit for us.
Sure. I think that's a fair read of where I'm coming from in a lot of my research. So there is this deep tension between legacies of authoritarian rule and a very bright democracy we have today. And I think this interplay is fascinating and one of the fundamental features of South Korean society today. A lot of people, when they look at democracy anywhere in the world, they tend to kind of rip it out of historical context. And in some ways, if you look at South Korea's democracy as institutional practice, as elections, party politics, in some ways it looks kind of okay. Elections have been basically free and fair, with some blips in the last decade, but it looks basically free and fair. My thought is that that way of approaching South Korea's politics misses quite a bit, and we need to put it back into historical context. And when we do that, then we see again some of the troubling things that persist from the past, but also some of the really bright hope that isn't captured by everyday electoral and party politics. So this is sort of where I'm coming from.
So let's introduce at least that history there. So there's this phrase that many people have in their mind about South Korea, and that's the idea that it is a developmental state. And the idea that, I suppose some people have popularized this over the years, people like Greg Brzezinski, for example, the idea of authoritarian state building. So what do people mean when they talk like this? Because a lot of the foundations of democracy come from this Cold War legacy.
Right. Well, I think we can go even further back to thinking about South Korea as a post-colonial society, a society that even today is still grappling with being in that situation. So coming out of colonial rule, we had immense conflict on the Korean Peninsula after 1945, conflict between government and local groups. This put certain figures into power in the southern part of the peninsula, figures who were not so keen on local participation in politics, and who, with the backing of the United States, could label a lot of local aspirants to political power as communists. And this dynamic helped to foster a regime that was deeply anti-participatory, deeply illiberal, and that only got stronger over time. So I think we should put today's South Korea in the context of this longer history of a post-colonial society.
And you mentioned here through your work, and I suppose you touched on it quite a bit there a couple of times, that you see a lot of the interaction here. And of course, we're going to really dig into this as we go through this interview here. But you see South Korea's democratization as needing to be understood in terms of the interplay of formal and informal structures. So let's dig a little bit in that now, and then we can build into it further on.
Sure. If we look only at the formal rules anywhere really, but in this case in South Korea in particular, I think we miss a lot of what is going on. So if we look only at the constitutional structure of the Republic of Korea, it will tell us some things, but it will not tell us about how politics is actually working. It will not tell us how people are using those rules. It will not, if there's a separation of powers, it will not tell us whether power is actually separated and limited in any meaningful way. So I think quite a bit of what happens in formal institutionalized politics in South Korea in the last few decades is that we get some formal structures that look very good in terms of limiting authority, but they also create or preserve space for older agglomerations of power to persist. And so this I think is another central tension that I focus on in my work.
And there's another wonderful phrase that comes in here, and I know it wasn't you that first used it, I believe, and that's the idea that instead of this idea of a developmental state or an authoritarian state building idea, we should perhaps look at South Korea as a conservative democratization, that movement there. So, what exactly is coming out of that phrase, and why is it so important?
Sure. So the idea of conservative democratization is from a Korean political scientist named Choi Jang-jip. And Professor Che is the most prominent scholar and public intellectual on Korean democracy. And his observation is that we should understand South Korea's democracy in the last few decades in terms of a Cold War history. We need to understand that after independence from Japan and with the Cold War picking up very quickly after that, or Cold War forces coming to bear on South Korea very quickly after that, we have a limiting of the public political sphere. So immediately after the Japanese depart in 1945, we have activism from all segments of Korean society. It's not, much of it is not formulated in ideological terms. Eventually it does get expressed in those terms and put into categories of left and right. But as the nascent Cold War builds, the forces associated, rightly or wrongly, with the left are discredited and left out of formal politics. And Professor Che's point with this idea of conservative democracy is that legacy continues, that the left or forces that might be associated with the left, in particular labor or possibly groups representing farmers, really struggle to gain voice in public party politics. And so this leaves us with this electoral competition that is not rooted in a social class divide.
So this is a very interesting idea here, the idea that there is this Cold War hangover in many ways, in not just in institutions, perhaps in the minds of the people as well inside the country. Which begs the question, before we get into the actual institutions and the laws that actually do this on the ground, I might ask you a question of why is this the case in South Korea? So, of course, it's not the case in other countries around the world. So why do you see this being the case? Do you think it's simply something that is peculiar and parochial just to South Korea? Or is it something to do with perhaps the speed in which the country modernized?
Well, I think it has to do with the political structure of the society that emerged in the middle part of the 20th century, and the real challenge of trying to alter that power structure. I think that is fundamentally what is at stake here. Of course, every society is a bit different, but I think that the struggles that South Korea experiences with changing that power structure are not, entirely unique to this place.
So let's jump into the details here and build this up from the ground here. So there's an idea that the laws inside South Korea today still hold this legacy that we've been speaking about so far. Mm-hmm. And I suppose we have to go back, quite a long way, all the way back to 1948, which is the American rule, or the end of the American rule. But if we push forward 10 years after that to 1958, there's the introduction of an election law that is passed, and it imposes strict limits on campaigning. And you write that it is Japanese inspired. So it's a restriction on the formation of other political parties and how they campaign. And it's got a Japanese lineage here. So in some ways, it's a country that has taken authoritarian, lessons, not just from the immediate American rulers inside the country, but also the Japanese.
That's right. In that case, it's kind of partly just because that's the main reference point that lawmakers and legal scholars in Korea in the 1950s had. They were presumably educated in Japanese law, and that was kind of the most easy reference to hold on to for them. And this is why they turned there. I can give a little bit of background on that law because, as you note, I think it is foundational to understanding how electoral politics, even today, is organized in South Korea. The 1958 election law was a very important change in South Korea's party and electoral politics, and it came about as the result of a negotiation between the ruling and opposition parties at the time. This is the period when Lee Syngman is president of the country, and there's his ruling Liberal Party. In 1956, there had been a presidential election, and the more popular figure of Jo Bong-am, who was not a member of either of the two major parties, did surprisingly well in that presidential election. Wasn't close to winning, but won about 30% of the votes. And this sent a signal to both the ruling party and the major opposition group that there was this third force out there that could draw on popular energy and was a concern. And so this inspired the ruling party and the opposition to get together and have a very lengthy set of negotiations over what to do about this situation, basically working together to try to set up an electoral regime that would prevent third parties from doing so well in elections. And the bargain they struck was this 1958 election law that drew inspiration from the earlier militarist era Japanese election law, which today I think is a very strange point. And one reason I highlight this is to remind friends in Korea that this is the origin of the basic election law we have here, and that it deserves some reconsideration. It was not the most liberal way of thinking about how to run elections. One of the main features is trying to limit chances for contact between candidates and voters. The concern is that such contact can create opportunities for corruption. That is, candidates would try to manipulate voters. If you have too many rallies, then candidates would pay people to come to those rallies and make their numbers look inflated, their support look inflated. And so there were a lot of restrictions, short campaign periods, and so on in this 1958 election law.
So the modern day importance of this law, I'm assuming, is an idea that it was originally incorporated to, I suppose, suppress grassroots mobilization and to favor the larger parties. And of course, it has a legacy today. And I'm assuming this legacy is that it still is there inside South Korean politics, that you can use campaign regulations to sideline competitors. And this is deep and fundamental to the South Korean democracy still today.
So this is the argument that I make, and that a handful of legal scholars and one or two political scientists in Korea make. Of course, these regulations are presented in different terms in public in Korea. So what happens over the ensuing decades is that these rules on campaign become slightly more sophisticated, but the basic spirit of the original law remains in place. And once we come to 1987 and the major democratic transition, revision of the Constitution, allowing former political dissidents to come back into politics, we have a real opening, in some sense, of the political system. And yet, this election law is not fundamentally reconsidered. They redo the electoral system, that is, the rules for how you divide up constituencies and select people for the National Assembly, but they did not fundamentally rethink the laws governing, say, election campaigns. And so they can maintain them, not in the name of suppressing competition or suppressing participation. That would not make any sense as a public expression, but in the name of fairness. And so a lot of the language around the election law in the last 30 years has been about the need for fairness, for preventing corruption. And of course, this can work in an authoritarian regime. It can also work in a democratic regime. Nobody wants unfair elections. Nobody wants corruption in their elections. But there are some hidden costs to that. A sort of bargain is struck where we get elections that are so regulated that we may say this helps diminish corruption, but it also has these effects of diminishing certain forms of participation.
So Sangmanri falls in 1961 to a coup, and then 2 years later, Park Geun-hye comes to power. And when he comes to power, he also introduces a political act, which is going to be important throughout this podcast. So we're going to dig into it quite a bit of detail here, and that is the Political Parties Act. So, what is that act?
Okay, right. So, 1960, Syngman Rhee falls in the April Revolution. Then we have a brief interlude where the opposition, the Democratic Party, is in power in a parliamentary system. May of 1961, we have the coup, and Park Geun-hye leads a junta for the next 2 years. Then he knows that he has to restore a civilian order. He cannot run the country as a general for a long time, and there's both domestic and foreign pressure on this. In terms of foreign pressure, I think he knows that he needs to demonstrate to the U.S. that South Korea remains on the right side of things, that this is a democracy. We need to demonstrate to our supporters in Washington that we are a democracy, and this is a major, if not the most important reason why a civilian order needs to be restored. Domestically, the claim is that the coup was no coup; it was a revolution. It's called a revolution during this period, possibly the only positive use of the term revolution during this period of authoritarianism in Korea, because of course revolution would often be associated with communism. But the coup of May 1961 is referred to by the junta and later by Park Geun-hye as a revolution, and as a revolution that is continuing the student uprising against Lee Syngman of 1960. So the public justification for the coup is that it was needed in order to fulfill the spirit of a democracy movement. Students and others in 1960 had been frustrated about the massive use of corruption to win elections and perpetuate the Syngman Rhee regime. The regime had responded with violence, and this had led to more protests that eventually toppled the regime. So Park claimed that his coup was continuing in that spirit. Now, if you're going to make that argument, then you certainly need to restore something that looks like democracy. You cannot continue to have straight up military rule. So in 1962, the junta is preparing the grounds for a restoration of civilian rule. This means that political party activities will be permitted again, that elections will be held for the National Assembly and for the president. So it's a period of building new institutions and remolding other old institutions so that we can have elections that have some degree of openness. But of course, there's an eye to setting it up such that Park Geun-hye has the best chance of doing pretty well in these elections. So the Political Parties Act of 1963 comes about in that context. It is an entirely new set of rules that are devised for telling us how parties should organize, what kind of things they can and cannot do. And it's set up in such a way that is, of course, going to benefit Park Geun-hye and his new party, then called the Democratic Republican Party.
Now, there's a certain indicator that was running through what you're saying there, and it's in your research. And this is quite fascinating. It's subtle as well, but it is with the idea that it's South Korean democracy sits in the terms of how it relates to civil society in a way that people from other, particularly Western countries, may not fully understand. And that is, you mentioned that South Korean law treats South Korean political parties as a special category. They are political organizations. They are not what most of us consider them to be, as in continuations of civil society. And you say that this has a fundamental indicator for South Korean civil society, and that is, it may look vibrant and it may look quite expressive and have a certain degree of difference across it, but this shouldn't necessarily this doesn't necessarily indicate that there is a decent degree of protection for the expression of different political interests inside the country.
Hmm. That's right, and it may suggest limits to the impact of that civil society as well. But yeah, let's start with the history there. So going back again to this immediate post-independence period, so August, September 1945, when we have this mass activism in Korean society. Well, there's all sorts of new organizations springing up, and they give themselves all sorts of new names. Some call themselves political parties, some call themselves other kinds of things. There is no clear dividing line between what is a political party and what is some other kind of civic organization. Well, eventually some rules develop for making that distinction, for deciding which groups have a right to participate in formal politics and which ones have less right. So some rules are put in place during the initial American period. The constitution that the Republic of Korea gets with the formation of the Republic in 1948 doesn't really give us this kind of separation. And in some ways, this should not be so surprising. The Americans who were presumably very influential in the process of writing the Constitution, well, they had not thought of their own democracy in terms of parties being constitutional bodies or bodies that you need to regulate. So I think that is less surprising. As time passes, the range of things that can be called a party begins to narrow. And this kind of reaches its apex in 1963 with the Political Parties Act, where you have to meet very rigid criteria, very specific criteria in order to register as a political party. You need to have headquarters in Seoul and kind of reach across the whole country. Some local movement cannot declare itself to be a political party, and that means they cannot field candidates in elections. So you need to fit these very specific criteria set by the state of what a party is. Now, in having these kinds of rules, South Korea is not entirely unique. It's here that it departs from the American heritage and turns in a bit more German direction. And there had always been a direct and especially indirect influence from the Prussian Old German legal order on Korea. The Japanese had been inspired by the Prussian, and this had been transferred to South Korea. So we have this kind of funny amalgam of German and American influences in South Korean public order. The idea of a political party law is a West German idea, but the South Koreans were one of the first people to actually put in place a separate Political Parties Act in 1963. And so one thing this does, to get back to your question, is to formalize this division between what belongs to the realm of party politics and what belongs to civil society. So this narrow set of things, these groups that have the right to participate in elections, if they meet certain criteria, they get to be called political parties. Everything else is sort of just civil society.
And there's a fascinating part here. Throughout your research, there's one thing that really caught my ear here, and this is the idea that the Constitutional Court did a ruling on this Political Parties Act. And it actually ruled quite clearly that it was designed to weaken smaller and regional parties. So there's no obfuscation of its intention here. And you write that the argument for many people, of course, is that this has a certain history that runs back. It's the idea of keeping democracy safe from anti-democratic forces, for example. And of course, that history is something we've gone through already. But you actually say that this claim and this law is founded on a different fundamental idea, and that is the idea that democracy requires a small number of large parties. So that is really quite interesting.
Yeah, I think so, especially if one is coming from a more parliamentary system. This seems quite counterintuitive and against ideas of representation. And I think also we should keep in mind that there is certainly no agreement or consensus in Korean society about this. And a lot of the discussion this year has been about how to increase representation, how to give minority voices have minority voices better reflected in government, and to have a government that reflects pluralism. So this line of argumentation has really come to the fore, especially in the past year. But No, precisely. Earlier, there were a couple of justifications for having such a rigid definition of what a political party is as a national organization. And the first is, of course, the need to prevent communist groups. In some ways, the domestic socialist threat, at least as it was imagined, was seen as a local one. It's one that can come out of local areas. And so preventing groups formed in local areas from entering into electoral politics was one way of being anti-communist. And the second line of argumentation that I think is more common in the post-democratic transition era is that, if we have small parties, it's going to create chaos or instability in our legislative politics. And there's a kind of ironic line of reasoning that's been used a few times by the Constitutional Court, which is that if we have smaller parties or parties that are tied to particular localities, then they will only be pursuing the particular interests of those localities and not be thinking about the national interest. And when they talk about this reason, they invoke regionalism as a terrible part of Korea's politics. So it's regionalism, that is a division between the major political parties along regional lines, is a little bit less prominent in South Korea's politics today, but it was a major feature in the 1990s and a bit beyond. And it's regularly treated as a negative part, that parties were fighting over which region they belong to rather than over policy. And so in some Constitutional Court rulings, it's been argued that small parties would exacerbate regionalism. This is ironic because it's precisely the major national parties that have fostered regionalism, and the locally based parties really have not done so.
And just to give people a clear picture of this is not a law that, or at least an idea that came into people's minds, so it runs in both ways there, but something that's in people's, that something exists that is not properly applied. As you've documented here, between 1988 and 2014, 61 different parties across South Korea have been deregistered over the years. So this seems to have something that really has on-the-ground impacts and still runs quite heavily through politics today.
Absolutely. And, in pointing these things out, I'm just also trying to raise some awareness. And I think it could be good if there's a bit more debate in South Korean society, if this is the kind of structure we want to have, or do we want to allow a more open competition and then kind of see where the cards fall, allow competition to weed out the weaker parties. There has been a tendency to let law and courts and the election commission to do that, and it's arguably not the best way to go about doing things. So what kind of parties get excluded? Well, it includes parties that are actually very popular or that can be quite prominent, and you can think of examples where we see precisely this divide between very active civil society and the barriers that are created to getting into party politics. You could take especially parties that are more progressive or aligned with labor or the environment. The Green Party, for example, can be quite prominent in demonstrations that bring together lots of people. They can be on the ground, they can be distributing their banners. We can see them very prominently, but they really struggle to get into electoral politics in a big way.
So let's move on to another body, and this is the Electoral Commission, or it was renamed the Central Election Management Commission in 1963. And this is in many ways the constitutional overseer of democracy. And again, many people have this idea in their mind that an overseer of democracy might have a central ethos that should encourage certain values or encourage participation or competition. But you're right here, this does nothing of the sort. It's not focused on that at all. It's simply a narrow bureaucratic focus on the operations of elections.
That's right. So South Korea's had an elections commission since 1948. in 1963, again in this transition period where Park Geun-hye is reestablishing civilian rule, he reorganizes the election commission and renames it. I call it the Central Election Management Commission because that is the literal translation of the Korean name. In English, they go by National Election Commission, but management is very, very central to how they perceive themselves. So I like the Korean name better. So it gets this name, and a few years prior to that, it had been elevated to this constitutional status, which in some ways is a positive thing. They can have some independence, but of course, by the same token, that means they have less accountability. There is it's hard to have oversight over the election commission. Like the election campaign law, as the democratic transition unfolded in 1987 and the political values of South Korean society transformed, there was very little change in the election commission. The democracy movement, which mobilized so many aspects of society, simply passed by the election commission, perhaps because it was a bureaucracy, part of the state. There were simply very few ties between those involved in the democracy movement and the commission itself. There was some slight turnover in the personnel at the highest level, but it was a very minor change. And even today, I found, looked at these histories of the election commission written by the election commission themselves in recent years, and they make very little reference to the democracy movement. The way they imagine South Korea's political history is not in terms of democratization, which to me is rather startling in a place that is in some ways very much a liberal democracy.
So we should at least put forward what seems to be a positive that comes out of this commission, though, and that is there's an idea here that throughout newly emerging democracies, there is a high level of not just corruption, but vote buying and threats of violence and these sorts of extreme irregularities. And you write that the extreme discipline that this organization, this commission imposed, so that focus on not on the grassroots, but on simply the tight regulations of elections themselves, it had at least one positive upswing, and that was those that sort of street violence and vote buying. It occurred across Southeast Asia and other emerging democracies, but it didn't have the same presence in South Korea. That's right. The commission has been very serious about fighting certain forms of monetary exchange in connection with elections, or allowing shady, violence-connected characters to do very well in politics, and they're quite proud of this record. This was kind of one focus in the democratic transition period as well, that there's a major increase in the budget that goes to the election commission, which is, and the commission itself tends to be headed by judges and former prosecutors and some other kinds of bureaucrats. And they come with this mindset that elections are something that we need to keep clean. And they have they had a lot of resources to pour into that, so they can police elections. The election commission even has the right to charge people with certain kinds of election offenses without even going to police or prosecutors. And they have taken that role very seriously. Today, when we see elections happening in Korea, you will see, very rarely will you see a campaign poster up in the period before the official election campaign period begins. That is illegal. And when posters are put up, it's often the election commission itself, not the candidates or parties that put them up. And they're able to control these things. So this does make South Korea stand apart from many of the other electoral regimes in East and Southeast Asia. However, this, I suppose what we've been speaking about a lot here is the idea of limited pluralism in South Korean democracy. And that's a phrase that you use a lot through your writing here. And one of the challenges that come from it, and people may have certain allusions as well to what's happening in the Western world around, especially parts of Europe today as well, with the changes happening there. And that is the idea that when representative institutions decline or are not there to represent people on the ground, it opens up a certain space, and that space can often be taken up by business or by the state itself, and you lose you lose grassroots representation, and it doesn't just stay there as a void. It is taken up by other parts of the state or by, as I said, business themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. So the kind of strict bureaucratic attitude of the election commission helps to keep politics clean in a certain way. Certain kinds of violations are taken more seriously than others. But this also dampens participation and makes it harder for certain political forces to break into politics. In particular, candidates who may have genuine popular followings. It can be more difficult for them to get into politics because of the way the election campaign law is written, and because of the zealous attitude of the election commission in enforcing it. So we get things expressed in other ways where. So this all brings us also back to this division between political parties and civil society, that we have so much energy on the streets back in the days in the 1980s with the before and during the democratic transition, and continuing after that into the present, in part because there's a sense that the formal political parties are unable to channel all of the interests that are coming from people. And so what we need to do is turn to civil society groups or take to the streets directly to express our interests.
So let's step forward with an interesting challenge here. And this is the idea that when democracy comes around, there is this, I suppose, an idea in people's minds that authoritarianism of the past is wiped away, that one cleans the other. And an important part of your research is, especially concerned with South Korea, of course, is the idea that this does not happen. It does not clean away all the past. And there's certain questions that need to be asked of populations, like what should we wipe away, and what is simply part of the state, and what is natural and should linger around. And this is the challenge, I suppose, of de-authoritization of a country. And you write that I suppose the biggest step in this regard happened with the constitutional revisions of 1987 and 1988. So I might get you to start there, and then we can build this forward.
Sure. Yeah. So when I'm looking at South Korea's democratic politics, I'm interested in the country itself, but also in trying to shed light on democracy as a more universal form of politics. And one mistaken way of thinking that became prominent, at least until very recently, was that once you have a certain set of democratic institutions in place, then things will work out fairly well. I think there has been a tendency not to see some of the potentially dangerous parts of democratic structures. That is, there are ways to formally look like a democracy but suppress participation, or there are ways that demagogues can emerge and subvert the basic principles of democracy, but using elections themselves. These concerns about democracy were big in writing on politics long ago in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, but those lessons were kind of forgotten in subsequent decades. I think given events around the world in the last 3 years or so, we're being reminded that democracy can lead to different sorts of political forms. And that is kind of one of the lessons that I've been trying to draw out of the South Korean experience, that as we've moved to a society that in some ways kind of hits all of the buttons in terms of looking like a liberal democracy, and in some ways really has deep liberal political values, the substance of politics may not have changed as much as we would hope. So going back to 1987, this is a period where we've had several years of mass political movement. Koreans are thinking in different ways about their nation. They're shifting, they're beginning to shift from an understanding of Koreanness as being a Republic of Korea, a South Korean anti-communist identity, to more pan-Korean ways of understanding their nation, celebrating folk culture, celebrating things they have in common with their brethren to the north. And these ideas are part of the movement to change the state. This comes to a head in 1987, and the regime finally capitulates in a certain sense and announces an immediate program of political liberalization. This is followed by constitutional reform, which gives us a really fundamental break. 1987 is a watershed moment, no doubt. Some of the most important changes are the restoration of direct presidential elections, which had been suspended in 1972. So after 15 years, we have direct presidential elections reinstated. We have an electoral system that will allow the opposition to potentially win the National Assembly. This had also been impossible over the past 15 years. We have a sharp decline in arbitrary repression from the state. So all of these things matter a lot. Nonetheless, there are some important continuities. And this is possible because of the way that in part because of the way that constitutional reform was undertaken. The opposition that was sitting in the National Assembly negotiated with the ruling party to redesign the electoral system. And they did so in a way that gave the sitting opposition better chances to gain power. But they did not open up the system so much so that all of these popular forces on the street, all of these kinds of activists, would have a good chance of breaking into electoral politics. And I think that this was a force for some continuity with the past.
And just to be clear, you say in your research that this isn't entirely down to the ruling right-wing parties at the time. There's an idea here that even they at the time they were the left wing of Korean politics, of course. They didn't really have the huge incentive to reform the system as people might have imagined. What they focused on was winning the presidency, and they were in a privileged position as being a major party at the time. And one of the key focuses they had wasn't so much on tearing it all down, but simply winning control of the state.
That's right. And this takes us back to this idea from Choi Jung-jip of conservative democracy. So the opposition party or parties of the time, they would split and come together from time to time. Well, we need to think about their lineage. Well, they go back all the way back to the period between 1945 and 1948, and had been basically handpicked by the Americans. And it was a group that was comprised mostly of people who had not done so poorly during Japanese colonial rule. So this was kind of the kernel for what's usually been called the Democratic Party in Korea, and which became the main opposition over decades of authoritarianism. They did not represent a distinct social base in society from the ruling party. They were not representing farmers or workers. They had this old base in the privileged class in South Korea. Now, during the period of authoritarian rule, the opposition would, of course, denounce dictatorship and gain support, especially in cities, from those who agreed with that position, but they were not radical. They were not radical or leftist in any sense. Those who were demonstrating on the streets in the 1980s, those who were leading the political and social movements in society, had different sorts of social bases in farmers, in workers, in different groups in Korean society. But they were not involved in the process of redesigning electoral institutions. And this is where I don't want to sound too pessimistic about Korea, but this is where I think concern should be expressed, that the design and redesign of institutions has almost always been in the hands of those who have been privileged to begin with. And those who are farther from power have had real difficulty getting into the process of redesigning institutions.
And as we speak about aspects of South Korean society that are unreformed despite the move to democracy, one of the most prescient ones is the National Security Act, or the National Security Law, sorry. And this is fascinating because when the country does democratize, one of the most important things in people's minds is the idea of security forces should be employed less, and the military should have less of a role in public life, and you should separate these things as much as possible. And yet this national security law, which I'll get you to introduce, remains on the books and remains on the books today.
Yes, that's right. So the national security law was introduced by Syngman Rhee soon after the establishment of the republic. It is also a kind of quasi-Japanese legacy. That is, the Japanese had a public security law that was used in Korea and in other colonies, and it was basically repackaged by Syngman Rhee and put in place, and was very convenient for not only security purposes, but for persecuting those who were perceived as his rivals. So the National Security Act allowed those suspected of being agents of Pyongyang to be detained without due process. Some scholars even argue that it's kind of like the real constitution of South Korea, because it takes precedence over anything that is guaranteed in the constitution itself. Over the years, the national security law gained a reputation for doing precisely that, for being used to persecute those who might possibly be challengers or critics of the regimes. So one would imagine with the democratic transition, again, you would imagine that this kind of institution would be rethought, maybe narrowed or abolished. And it has been up for debate on a few occasions where there have been those arguing that we need to, it has this terrible history and we need to abolish it, or at least need to reform it. It has been through some reforms, but it has not been abolished. And it has continued to be invoked. I think in most years, I think a few hundred people have been detained under the national security law. Certainly, it hasn't been used to the degree that it was for political purposes, to the degree that it was used in past decades. Nonetheless, it's rather surprising that this law has lingered.
And while we're talking about continuity in this way, we must talk about Park Geun-hye and move forward to a very interesting part of South Korean democracy, and that's the party cancellation system. And of course, Park Geun-hye is the daughter of Park Chung-hee, and she comes to power, and as you document here, she brings in a lot of her old father's advisors and people that were around her father and were helping him when he was in power. And in her first year in office, she uses a constitutional clause, and of course it's been on the books for decades. And what she actually does is she disbands a single minor progressive party. So that's the UPP, the United Progressive Party. And I might get us to start here, because this is a really interesting way. It's a very small party inside South Korea, and yet she uses this part of the constitution to remove it. And she removes it under the idea that it is a threat to national security, I believe.
That's right. So this was a party that had just a few seats in the National Assembly, and the it was discovered that the leader of the party, who was a legislator, had 10 years previously written some memo which suggested that he was advocating revolution. This was put in the media and caused outrage. Everyone, most legislators with all of the major parties thought this was an outrage, and they saw the surveys of public opinion in the wake of these revelations, and the National Assembly voted to remove him from his position. He was detained, and I think a few of his other party members were detained under the national security law. And then the party's registration was canceled by the president's order. So I think this was a concerning moment concerning that a national security law would be invoked for a figure as minor as this. I mean, there was no way this guy was an actual present threat to national security, even if he had been tied up in some kind of questionable things in the past. It's hard to say that he was a present threat to national security. Nonetheless, the major parties supported getting rid of him. And then this clause in the Constitution was used to eliminate the party's registration. And that move garnered more widespread concern within Korea and outside. This is a law that some countries in Europe have. It's called a militant democracy clause. And the basic idea is that we need to worry about anti-democratic parties hijacking democracy. We don't want parties that do not believe in the democratic order from gaining power through democratic means. This came about in post-war Germany for understandable reasons. In Korea, this was introduced in 1960, and it made sense in a kind of Cold War context. This was not a post-fascist context where there was an old Nazi party that might try to come to power again. But the legislators at the time thought it could be rather useful as a way to prevent parties on the left or popular parties from getting too powerful. It was never used, and it's subject to review by the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court was not made until after 1987. And then Park Geun-hye invoked this in the first part of her term, and the Constitutional Court upheld the ruling, and so the party lost its status. So this could be seen as a rather heavy-handed way that the state has intervened in modes of representation.
So let's step forward to a fascinating theme through your research here, and that is democracy is more than a political system. And this is very, very important for South Korean democracy in many ways, because the formal institutions, as you mentioned, and we've gone through a lot of them that exist from the authoritarian era there, they still exist. But there's also beyond that formal engagement, there's an informal engagement by South Korean citizens that makes South Korean democracy quite vibrant. And of course, this comes to light in most people's minds in 2016 with the Candlelight Revolution. So there has some lineages that go back, though. This is not the first time in South Korean democracy that these kinds of mass movements have brought down leaders or governments. You talk about the April Revolution in 1960, the Gwangju Uprising in 1980, the June Struggle of 1987. So let's dig into this issue that South Korean democracy, despite all that overlay that we've been talking about of potential authoritarian shadow lingering here, it's still underneath it all has incredibly vibrant, incredibly strong, incredibly resilient informal structures.
Sure. Yeah. I think traditionally South Korea's democracy has been praised for the wrong reasons. That is, there's a tendency, whether it's mostly international observers or those who are thinking kind of from the frames of international observers, well, Korean elections seem to be basically free and fair. There are multiple parties. People can more or less say what they want. There's turnover in office, that is, parties alternate in office. There's clearly contestation in society. Korea looks like a good liberal democracy. My point is twofold. One, that's not quite right. Those institutions do not check power to the same extent that it appears they do. This comes up again when we discussed the election laws and the election commission, where there is this trade-off between regulating and stamping out certain kinds of corruption, but also preventing certain forms of participation. So we get this strong top-down streak in Korea's formal party and electoral politics that leaves a lot of people out of the political system. But to my mind, we shouldn't just end up with a very negative conclusion. Rather, there's a very positive story here about people demanding to be heard and sometimes actually being heard. But this is occurring not through these institutions that are associated with democracy, but through this other realm of activism, through organizations that are not formally connected to political parties, and more recently, not through organizations at all, but through people getting together on the streets, on the internet, and demanding change. And I guess one theme that we see a lot, especially in the past 3 years, is that these demonstrations are remarkably positive. They are happy events. During the candlelight movement, the feeling was very positive. These days, we have demonstrations in defense of the justice minister and arguing for prosecution reform. These are also overwhelmingly positive events. Remarkably, there is almost no episode of violence or conflict during these mass demonstrations, despite the fact that tens or hundreds of thousands of strangers are coming together on the streets. And if we put this in a broader international perspective, especially of 2019, this is truly astounding. Most of the demonstrations around the world, the mass politics we say around the world today, is so negative. It's fueled by anger and hatred toward particular groups. But here in South Korea, we're getting people together being happy and positive.
Now, that is a fascinating turn here, because at least something that I've bumped into your research, and of course I've heard this before, and it's a deeper history, or at least a longer history back in South Korea. So it's true, those protests about the justice minister that happen inside Seoul and across Korea today, and they're incredibly peaceful, just as they were during Park Geun-hye and all these other ones. But you mentioned this phenomena that dates back a bit further, and that is the street leaders of Seoul. And I might read the introductory sentence of this because it gives people a great feel. It says, in the decades and a half following Korean liberation from Japan in 1945, a category of men prowled Seoul's back alleys and also its halls of power. And that is this link between gangsterish elements in South Korea in those very early days and the development of the state. So something seems to have changed. I'm not sure if you see that as a change or something fundamentally, or whether it's just perhaps a dichotomy or a break in people's minds there. So how do you see that influence still inside South Korea today, if it is? And
Sure.
Do you see that something has changed here?
Oh, yeah. So in this period just after 1945, we have lots of activism, and then we have also lots of violence. In that particular article, in one stream of my research, I've looked at some of the figures, the violent figures who emerged in that process, and these were people who would basically work for anybody. The central figure I write about there, a man named Kim Do-han, is notorious or infamous in South Korea today. And he's mostly known as a character in films and television dramas, and he's portrayed as a national hero. In real life, he was an opportunistic specialist in using violence against fellow Koreans, and he worked for different groups at different times, and basically a vigilante activist who would work for mostly right-wing parties, eventually for the government. A lot has changed since that time, and it changed fairly quickly. In that very early period, there was some decentralization of the instruments of coercion. Subsequently, especially with the Korean War, and then again after the coup of 1961, put the security forces in strong central power, we have this real centralization of the use of violence. So South Korea remains a society riven by violence after that period, but it's in a much more centralized form. So we don't have these figures going around trying to sell violence to different sorts of political actors as we had in that very early period. But I think the kind of mass activism that we've had in Korea over many decades and that we still have today should be understood in relation to that, both that centralization of violence and to the construction of institutions that are in some ways anti-participatory, that appeal today, at least to values, democratic values associated, especially with fairness and neutrality, but do not create a lot of space for different social forces to break into formal politics and control government.
So there may be in people's minds as they listen to some of this a certain fear that the government is, I suppose, separated in many ways from civil society inside South Korea. There's a gulf here. But if we move back from those early movements that we touched on there to this Park Geun-hye movement and her removal from power through these mass protests, similar to which we're seeing today on the streets, it talks to a remarkable responsiveness of government. So we've been talking a lot about how civil society and the informal structures are engaged in a way that the formal structures are not, or certainly there is a difference here. But after the Constitutional Court removed Park Geun-hye, so there is a response from the institutions to the people on the streets. And of course, after she is removed from power, the new movements and Moon Jae-in comes to power, and the immediate impetus of this government is to try and address the grievances of that movement. So they try and reform the state so it can't be manipulated in the same way. They try and make the president's actions more visible. And they try to address, or he tries to address, as a central part of his politics. It became a central part of his politics. One of the things that was a grievance that a lot of the protesters had, which was inequality on the streets. So it does talk to, despite all we've mentioned, a responsiveness in government.
Yeah, precisely. I think that, and that's further grounds for hope. So when the movement to remove Park Geun-hye gained strength in late 2016, this led to in December, then the National Assembly voting on the impeachment. There were demonstrators outside the National Assembly that day, very noisy. The legislators would have heard that noise, right? And members of her own party joined the vote to impeach her. Similarly, when we got a few months later to the Constitutional Court ruling to confirm that she should be removed from office, no doubt the justices also heard the voices on the street. And this really set us on course for a correction. So this is again, 2016, when there's negativity about democratic institutions around the world, we have this remarkable recovery seeming to be in place in South Korea. So I don't want to suggest that reform is impossible. I think we're seeing that it is really quite possible. We also see political parties that now incorporate some elements that had been excluded before. I would say that the current ruling party is sort of half coming from this former activist base and is not simply representing a direct continuation of the old elite.
So as we wind this up, there's a couple of important questions here, and that is, the institutions we've been talking about, it also has an impact on people's minds. So as democracy opened up and became something inside South Korea, it was authoritarian at first. The talk was of democracy, but it was authoritarian, and the authoritarian structures, as we mentioned, have remained. So I might ask you a couple of challenging questions to end this up here. There's a problem here that is a fear that it's not simply the case that you can reform some of the institutions. It's that maybe that South Koreans have developed an idea of democracy, and they've developed at a time and in a way that they've internalized a certain authoritarian trend. So do you see a difference here? Do you think that it's enough to, if you had your way and you could reform South Koreans' authoritarian hangovers in some way, do you think that would be enough, or do you think there is an ideological or a cultural problem perhaps inside South Korea that allows or makes it okay for some of these things to remain?
Yeah, I think this is kind of precisely the conflict that we see unfolding today with the debates or fight over the reform of the prosecution. This is an episode in this major struggle over what do we do with this state that was designed to serve a certain narrow set of social interests. How do we reform this in a democratic era? And people understand it in different ways. This gets to the ideological or cultural point. I think ideas can change. I think there is a set of public justifications that can be given for defending the way the prosecution operates today. Those have to do with things have the way the state is arranged today has kept the country basically safe from North Korea, and we have gotten prosperous, and so we need to maintain things the way they are. I think this is part of the public line that can be given by those that are trying to preserve the prosecution as it is and to remove the justice minister. Some people will believe that, and that's how it works in a liberal society. But I think a lot of people have realized that this institution is problematic, and that this is precisely what happens at these rallies. Even just last night, I was at observing the rally to defend the justice minister, and there you had different speakers, including former activists, telling people about what the prosecution has done in the past and how it's behaved in more recent years. And this can change people's ideas.
So there's an analogy here that you use, and it is the idea that democracy should be looked at as the process of tending a garden. And that is not just important for South Korea, but important for democracy around the world today. This seems to be coming under threat in ways that people didn't imagine. So there's this thought out there that you implement democracy, and the democracy then becomes this self-sustaining system you can then forget about, and it just operates in the background. But you look at it differently. You think it needs a continuous, rigorous effort on behalf of the citizenry to keep it upheld and sustainable. And from that, I'm not yet to talk about that analogy, of course, but from that, how do you see the future of South Korean democracy? Are you hopeful, or do you think that the authoritarian hangovers, as we mentioned, might sustain in some ways?
Yeah. So right. So I think a major way of thinking about democracy is, right, you set up the institutions and then just let it run. Academics, political scientists, for sure, have had this model for thinking about how democracy works, and I think that is fundamentally flawed. It overestimates the power of institutions and makes us think that everybody follows whatever institutions, whatever rules are formally written down. And I think that's rarely the case anywhere in the world. Rather, and I think this is what we will see people looking at societies all over the world increasingly understand. Yeah, it's something that we need to work at. We need to keep preserving democracy, addressing the challenges that arise. New challenges arise all the time, and we cannot just assume, well, we've got the right institutions, no problem. No, we need to adjust in order to meet those challenges. And again, this is what happened with the candlelight movement. Parts of the alternative media responded first, and got a response going. And then the more formal institutions of government also realized they needed to get on board. And so we had this very healthy kind of feedback. And today, with the issue of the prosecution, we are in a similar situation where we have this authoritarian legacy, and people are increasingly realizing that it needs to be reformed to come in line with the radically different political values that Korean society has now. And just because you get an administration that's committed to it doesn't mean that happens. That's the real struggle of Korea's democracy today, that we have a state that has been oriented to doing certain things, such as being a kind of security state or helping to promote industrialization, but not doing many other kinds of things like responding to inequality in society, keeping people safe from industrial pollution, and so on. And we have administrations more recently that are trying to do these things, but they struggle to do it because the state organs were not set up for it. So it's in this context that we have this struggle over the prosecution today. I'm optimistic. I think it's remarkable when we see people coming out to demand these sorts of reform. Prosecution reform can sound like a very obscure thing, and it may be amazing to think in another context that people would come onto the streets in their spare time to gather to advocate reform of the prosecution. But many people here understand how important it is to Korean history and to shaping how their politics operates. I would guess that that reform is going to be slow and gradual. I think this is sort of the pattern, that we get this confrontational politics that comes with a very positive side, but doing the actual reform is extremely difficult.
So that is a great note to leave this on. A lot to think about from that. Now, I always tend at the end of this podcast to lament that I never get a chance to go through all the topics, but that's never been truer than this moment here. There is so much more here. This is such a large topic. So I'm going to link below the podcast a series of articles that Erik has written here on the topic, but I'm also going to link his recent book, which is Top-Down Democracy in South Korea. Much, much more in there, much, much more that we didn't get a chance to go through. So go out, buy the book, go out and read his articles below. There is a lot more to get through, I promise you. On that, Erik Mobrand, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks very much, Jed. It's been my pleasure.